order. Hearing is now resumed.
Good morning, Commissioner Cohen. I'm Brian Wallace, Senior Commission Counsel. With me this morning for this panel are Patrick McGowan and Jennifer Chan. The panel today and for the next 5 days of hearings, the final 5 days of our evidentiary hearings, are the senior DFO officials all of whom have returned from previous visits here. And we've described this as priorities and summary panel. And Mr. Commissioner, I know you know all these people, but just for the record, closest to you is Dr. Laura Richards, who's the Regional Director of Science for the Pacific Region, David Bevan, Associate Deputy Minister, the Deputy Minister is Claire Dansero, and the Regional Director General, Sue Farlinger. I would like to just remind the witnesses that you've all been here before, which time you were previously affirmed to tell the truth in these hearings, and that still applies. I have one housekeeping matter to deal with by way of a document that has been serviced in the hearing a number of times and has been given the identifier of Exhibit B for identification. It is the first document in the Commission's list of documents. This is a Pacific Fisheries and Aquaculture Committee Working Group meeting minutes, meeting notes from March of 2005. And Ms. Farlinger, you were in attendance. I wonder, please, if you can just identify that. Did I get that wrong? Exhibit P for identification. Thank you. If you can just identify that document as being as it's described.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, may that be marked as the next exhibit, please.
1913.
Let me just start then with a question for Ms. Dansero and Mr. Bevan. And these are the first series of questions will deal with funding issues, and in particular the strategic review and strategic and operational review. The strategic review was a 2010 funding exercise, as I understand it, and as we've heard, that looks at cuts in of 5%. And it described as looking at DFO priorities and intended outcomes to determine whether DFO programs were aligned with its priorities. Currently, there's a strategic and operational review ongoing with a goal of 5 to 10%, as I understand it. And it's described as considering redesigning the delivery of current programs also, but asks, do these programs need to be delivered by public servants the same way, or can they be changed to reduce costs? The question is, the assertion is the DFO needs to change how it does business. If I may ask about the strategic review, what was the actual budget cut to DFO as a result of the strategic review?
56.8 million.
And by way of percentage, that is how much? Is it the 5%?
No, it's about 3%.
Thank you. And how much is being cut pursuant to the strategic and operational review, and when will these cuts take effect?
The number is obviously not finalized because we are in the process right now of developing the proposals and having them considered by Treasury Board and by Cabinet. So we are in no way able at this point to give a number because we haven't come to the end of the process.
Order of magnitude?
Well, 5 and 10%.
Okay. And when will these cuts begin to take effect?
The Strategic and Operating Review, also known as the Deficit Reduction Action Plan, would come into effect April 2012, and be for a duration of 3 years. Not that the money would come back after 3 years, but they would be implemented over a 3-year period.
And so that's 5%, 5 to 10% annually. It's not a diminishing amount. It stays at 5 to 10%.
So far, yes.
What consultation has taken place with respect to these decisions? Has there been any consultation with DFO regional or field staff?
There's definitely been consultation with DFO regions. The consultation, though, because these are budget processes, doesn't go very completely deep into the department nor outside of the department, as is fairly standard for these kinds of processes. But on certain elements, information is sought without necessarily discussing the overall proposals because of cabinet confidences.
Okay, so just to reiterate, and there's been no consultation outside the department?
No consultation outside.
As I understand the strategic and operational review, it considers whether DFO should be performing certain tasks and whether some of them can be done by others. If the public and stakeholders are being considered as possibly taking up some of these tasks, why would it not have been appropriate to determine capacity and the willingness to do some of these things?
It's a standard, as I said, it's a standard process for government in preparation for budget documents. There is a general type of consultation, and we are, as I think you know now, in constant consultation with our stakeholders, so we have a fairly good sense of what is possible. But really, the job right now, as the job should be for any government at any time, is to look at what we do and how we do it. And this is something that should be done on an ongoing basis anyway, and we should be the ones looking at that.
Am I correct that part of the strategic and operational review is to look at whether or not there are others who can do things that DFO is currently doing?
Yes.
And who are you looking at for that? Other levels of government or stakeholders?
In some cases, yes.
In non-governmental organizations?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Ms. Dancer, is there a level of funding below which DFO will not be able to manage the fishery and protect the fisheries resource?
I'm not sure that there's an answer to that question. Obviously, if there was zero money, there would be zero management, and we organize around what we have. So I would say we will continue to do the best that we can with the resources that we have, and we will continue, as resources diminish, we will continue to focus and prioritize and make sure that we are protecting the resources to the best of our ability with the resources that we have.
Is it your job to advise government on when these cuts are threatening DFO's ability to do its job?
If we felt that we absolutely could not find any savings, then yes, we would.
Have you given such advice to government with respect to these proposed cuts?
No.
One of the issues of that's come up in funding cut is the impact on harvest enforcement. And Randy Nelson has testified here that there's an ever-increasing amount of pressure and workload put on fisheries officers, and that conservation and protection is at capacity in terms of enforcement. We've also heard that there are areas of the coast that are infrequently patrolled. Despite this, we've heard that CNP is facing funding and possibly personnel cuts through the strategic and operational review and the non-renewal of what's been referred to as the Williams pick fee-based funding. Are you concerned about the impact of these cuts on CNP's ability to conduct a credible enforcement program?
It's my job to always be watchful and to make sure that we don't put forward proposals that would result in an inability to do work. There are different definitions, as I'm sure you are aware, different definitions of what work should be done, and that's why we have extensive processes to define priorities and to also, though, redefine on an ongoing basis, as every government should, how we do our work. And as you know, I think you know, the CNP group is looking at that at the national level and within each of the work units. So as the fisheries change, how we enforce and how we monitor also ought to change. And so budget levels that might have been required a number of years ago may not be the same budget levels that will be required in the future. They may be more, they may be less. So that's, but it requires that we have adequate planning processes with the input of the CNP officials and others as well on the management side to help us prioritize.
Mr. Bevan, you were a former director of conservation and protection nationally, I believe. Do you have any observations about the risks on funding to conservation and protection in British Columbia?
The levels of funding for conservation and protection in British Columbia and how we distribute the resources across the country have always been a question that requires constant reevaluation. So it's not like it's static. You have to look at what your situation is and determine if there's capacity to make changes. With respect to CNP, what the role on an annual basis is to evaluate risks, evaluate your performance from the previous year, look at your risks for the coming years, set your priorities, look at ways to realign how you do your business, how you do your enforcement activities, look at opportunities for new technologies and new approaches. Clearly, if you're doing the same thing year over year and your budget declines, you're going to have a decline in your activities. If, on the other hand, you're looking at use of new electronic information procedures such as vessel monitoring systems and e-logs and databases that can be compared, looking at your where you're spending your patrol hours, what the outcomes were. We expect managers in CNP to do all of that prior to coming to seek changes to resourcing levels or to justify continuation of B-based money. That's the kind of thing that we would expect. And it's not acceptable to have someone say, look, I'm going to do it the same way. I'm not going to change. And if I don't get this renewed, there'll be an impact on patrol hours. That's not something that we would want to see out of a management team. We'd want to see how they've evaluated the risks, how they're going to manage those risks, and how they're going to make changes to their business approach to doing the compliance work. If after all of that there's still a gap, then we would consider it on a national basis. But that's the process that we would go through. And someone coming to us saying, look, I'm going to lose 14 or 15 people and I don't want to change anything, is not going to get a very kind reception unless they've done their homework.
Your answer suggests that the solution lies in bringing in new technologies and replacing people with a different kind of enforcement technique. Is that correct?
We've gone from reactive enforcement was the focus that we've had in the past, where we send people out to do monitor, control, and surveillance. That can definitely fine poachers, fine non-compliance, but it fines one individual. It doesn't deal with the whole system. So what we've tried to move to is going to education and shared stewardship, bringing people along to understand the need for conservation, the need for compliance. Yes, we'll have monitor, control, and surveillance, but we also need major case investigation, so that if you have a systemic problem in a location or in a particular component of fish harvesting and processing, etc., you spend the resources to get at that systemic problem. And we've seen in many examples where we've used different data sets. We establish data sets so that officers can look at various sources of information, look for anomalies, and focus their investigations there. Those are the kinds of things that we would expect to be looking at, rather than just saying, okay, I had this amount of resources, my workload's gone up, I want more. We need to have a better business case so we can seek continuous improvement. I'm not saying that we're going to say, we can get rid of lots of fishery officers by introducing new technologies, because there is an increasing workload. But I am saying that it's not a simple number of fishery officers versus what was in the past and what's coming in the future. There needs to be a continuous challenge function put together by the regional office and by the national office to say, okay, let's look at better ways to get the job done. And we've seen some significant outcomes in a number of areas across the country where we've uncovered systems of non-compliance that were picked up through new technologies and new ways of using information. And that's what we expect across the country.
Such successes occurred in the Pacific region?
There have been successes in the Pacific region, but I can't point to one specific to Fraser River sockeye and some of the testimony you've heard, but I think that there's an opportunity in the very near future to employ the new technologies that are being and new processes that are being introduced already in the salmon fishery in British Columbia, and that is better use of information on a real-time basis. Use of sales slips and records of that nature is not going to give you the tools you need to deal with real-time problems, and I think there's a better way to approach that, and that's to me more exciting in terms of improvements than just more fishery officers, etc. So it's not to say that there won't be continuation of the funding, etc., but there will have to be a business case put forward with those kinds of considerations included.
One more thing, Mr. Redmond, before I'll come back to you, Ms. Danstrow. You would agree, though, that trying to replace fisheries officers by what I think it's called intelligence-led policing methods has a cost in terms of compliance?
I think that would be prejudging the outcome, and also we aren't interested in sort of dramatic shifts of trying to do something all at once. These are things that you should be testing before you look at any changing in funding. So it's not something you say, I think I can put in this new process and save 10 people. That's a bad way to approach the business. The better way is to look at ways to improve compliance through different methods, and you'll see what your funding requirements will be in the out years, but not to do it, not to cash in any savings before you have a chance to do so. Do that kind of evaluation to make sure you've got compliance. Because what you don't want to do is have compliance problems caused by your changes and either not be able to track them or not be able to then reverse the approach and go back to the traditional way. So it's an evolution, not a revolution. We're not looking at quantum changes. We're looking at continuous improvement in how we get compliance with the resources that we have.
If I can just add to that, and I agree with all of it, obviously, but the enforcement technologies will be one area that we look at. The other, though, are the policies that we are enforcing and how we're managing them, and that brings us to a management framework and a set of policies that may not require the same kind of attendance for each boat. So I use as an example that might be useful for the Commission the integrated ground fish management approach, which controls the bycatch, and I won't go into the details of that, but it allows us to manage within a fishery areas that would otherwise be required to be managed through enforcement. And there are electronic monitoring systems that we know exactly what boat caught exactly what fish. So I think there are examples that we can use on the policy side to make sure that what we are enforcing makes sense, both from a conservation perspective and from an industry requirement perspective. And then there are the technological changes as well, and they go together, and that becomes a management approach.
Ms. Frolinger, you will have heard that some of the people closer to the ground think that having conservation officers on the ground is at risk, and it's an important thing to try and maintain. Are you satisfied with the coverage you have, compliant as conservation and here?
a fairly broad question, but in general, it's important for us both on the management side and the enforcement side to continue to work together and evolve in the way that both David and the deputy have mentioned. And in fact, over the last couple of years, we've been working quite hard at making sure the management side, the science side, and the enforcement side are working more closely together to make sure that we're actually getting those connections and synergies. I think the question can always be asked, could you do with more fishery officers on the ground? And I guess, of course, you always could, in the same way you could do with more policemen on the highways. But by and large, the enforcement has been done in a way that respects the priorities that we need to meet. And that means that sometimes enforcement efforts will be focused in one area, and the next year they may be changed to another area. It doesn't mean necessarily that all areas are covered in the same way every year.
You've heard the evidence of Mr. Bevan and the deputy with respect to the need to do some testing, find out what works and what doesn't work. What are you doing in British Columbia to make sure that this new direction makes sense, or to test whether it does?
If we were to look at salmon in particular, that there's a good part of the PICFI program that is dedicated to looking at transformational kind of work. So what can we do about catch monitoring that is better and is modernized and takes account of the current context? Similarly, in enforcement, there has been a significant amount of resources, PICFI resources, put into building capacity and testing intelligence-led policing. There are certainly areas in co-management that we're testing and trying to move forward. So that's part of the continuous improvement process, and one of the ways in which we use what we call B-base or additional funding is to test how we need to change and whether in fact it's more effective or not.
Williams' report in 2004 recommended that DFO must ensure that adequate resources are available and the budget and staffing available for enforcement be increased. There was, as a result, Williams funding in 2005, which I think became part of PICFI, all of which will sunset in 6 months. So if this is supposed to be transformational, I guess the question is, has it worked? And the question is, if it is improving, the next question is, if it is improving enforcement, why is it being concluded?
That's certainly part of what we would evaluate and are actively evaluating is, as the program approaches its end, we're looking at all the funds that have been spent and the activities that have been done under that program, and looking at what our best advice would be to decision makers about where we need to move forward with that, or how we would implement it into our day-to-day work.
Let me just turn back to the question of the relative merits of officers on the ground and alternative methods of enforcement. Again, coming back to the evidence of Randy Nelson, he made the point that the biggest deterrent you can have is the presence of fisheries officers, and testified in his view there is absolutely a connection between fishery officer presence and the degree of illegal activity. Do you have any specific additional information that would suggest anything other than the correctness of that view?
I think that view relates to what risks you're trying to control. If you're looking at fraudulent activities, having fishery officers on the ground may not be effective at all. What's more effective is having fishery officers conducting major investigations using data sets that come from a variety of sources. So that kind of risk is not something that is addressed through fishery officers on the ground. What is addressed through officers on the ground is the kind of risk controlled by monitoring, control, and surveillance that would be poaching and those kinds of activities. But that's an expensive process if there's an alternative to having other data sets collected, different policies, as the deputy noted, different requirements to provide information to the government to demonstrate that your activities are consistent with conservation and are legal. If that's an alternative, then that's a more effective way of getting compliance than the boots on the ground analogy. The latter does apply when you don't have data sets, you don't have the requirements for the landing, etc., that you might otherwise have. Then you need to put fishery officers there to influence behavior during the fishery. And again, that's an expensive model. And the question is that the only model, or is there a better way of making changes to try and get that compliance? We all want compliance, and in the old model, if you're fixed on that monitor, control, and surveillance, you're going to need fishery officers. The question is there a way to get the right balance between that, the education, the shared stewardship, bringing the public and the participants in the fishery into the process of changing behavior and getting the culture of conservation imbued in the fishery. And then on the major investigations, you still have to have that capacity. So it's a matter of what your risk is, what your strategy for dealing with risks are, and then that helps determine how many people you need on the ground. So I think what Mr. Nelson was saying is that given the current method of management, the current practices, yeah, we need fishery officers, but that question is that the only way to get the compliance? Are there other alternatives?
Mr. Britton, you've been setting the two models sort of against one another and stating it as a question as to we have to determine what the better way to do this is. And I understand that the generalities. Can you direct us to any specifics as to what's being done to get the answer to that question? What specific initiatives is the department doing to evaluate current methods and comparing them with others? Are there some tests going on? What's going on?
Well, I can't specifically speak to what's going on in the salmon fishery here, but I know that we've changed the way we've handled things in the crab fishery. We've looked at the effectiveness of monitor, control, and surveillance versus using data sets to do major investigations, and it was stark. We were not getting results the old way. We were getting results the new way. And we have tremendous difference in our appreciation of the kind of activities that were involved in that particular fishery in Atlantic Canada. We've seen a more proactive approach with the groundfish integration in British Columbia, where we didn't have the problems with so much as compliance as with bycatch control. And that's another example of change. In the salmon fishery, we need to reconsider whether or not we can live with a sales slip model. I don't think so. Whether we can try to control it through monitor, control, and surveillance as the only way. That's dealing with individual interactions and not with the broader systemic issues. And I think we need to look at the systems that are in place in salmon to try and change those to make the improvements. But I don't know if there's...
Well, let me put that point to Ms. Frolinger. What are you doing to test these alternative hypotheses?
Well, as I mentioned, part of the PIC-FEE funding went towards conservation and protection, specifically to build capacity in what is called intelligence-led policing, which I think is the sort of general term for what David has just described. In addition, there have been funds and work put towards the examination of a share-based fishery in salmon and what the management and enforcement implications of that might be. Also on the catch monitoring side, and really all of those things have to be considered together in terms of modernizing the management of the salmon fishery, including the enforcement. So there has been considerable work, and we're in the process of pulling all that work together, analyzing what has been done. Did we meet all our objectives with the PIC-FEE program? Where we haven't met them, where should we go from here, and those kinds of things that really happen at the end of a program in terms of, is this ready to implement now, or is there more work required, or what will we do about it to carry it forward? So on all three fronts, I think there's been specific work funded through this additional B-based funding, and we are in the process of evaluating that right now.
Yeah, the two questions arising out of that. Can you be more specific about the process of evaluating, particularly the conservation and protection piece? What can you be more specific about what you're doing to evaluate the technologies which I gather I think I heard you say were being encouraged by PICFI funding?
Well, on the conservation and protection side, and I should say it varies across those three elements. On the conservation and protection side, we're working with national headquarters CMP folks. As you may have heard, the Director General of Conservation and Protection is currently running a process looking at modernization of CMP, and the results from Pacific Region work will be going into that process. I believe it's called CMP 2012, and so I do think it's very much anticipated that the results of that evaluation, in which we are participating, will be available in 2012.
And have you made a report to national headquarters on this topic?
It's more a case, there are reports involved, but it's more a case of bringing information together and working through the challenges, the information, and the problems to come up with something to implement on an ongoing basis.
An evaluation going on nationally in which British Columbia is participating, but am I correct, would I be correct saying that there's been nothing provided to national headquarters about this evaluation? Is it being looked at through a rigorous program where you're making comparisons and trying to draw conclusions as to what works and what doesn't, or is this just in the stage of general discussion?
As I understand the national process, that there's been considerable work over the last 3 or 4 months, and I believe there's a national meeting next week, and when various officers from various parts of the organization are coming together to evaluate the issues and to provide the regional perspective on that evaluation and analysis. I think because at the regional level, we have looked at the work that's been done under PICFI each year, and we ask for progress reports, and those become part of that broad evaluation. So I think the answer that you may be looking for is the evaluation is very much an ongoing process. It's a participatory process, and one that will come out with documented decisions at the end of it.
In the meantime, what's happening on the ground? Is the department committed to maintaining the current level of enforcement using conventional methods until the new ones have been proven preferable?
I think the process of looking at new methodologies, whether it's in fisheries management, whether it's enforcement or other things, is a combination of continuing to set priorities and provide the best service on the ground while testing new or evolving kind of methodologies and systems. And I think that it's very much looking at will share-based management, if we put it in place, affect enforcement? Will the new methodologies enforcement mean that we need less fishery officers on the ground? And in the meantime, the fishery officers continue to do their work according to the work plan for 2011-12.
Is the funding in the next fiscal year for CNP at risk in this region?
Not to my knowledge, but you've heard from the deputy that the department is undergoing an overall review of our processes.
Thank you.
If I may, again, it depends on your definition of at risk. Is the program at risk for enforcement? No. The level of funding is something that we will discuss according to priorities and according to new directions, as you've heard from both David and from Sue. So the program is not at risk. The level of funding may change.
By change, you mean be reduced?
Or who knows? There might be identified that some areas need to increase as well. So this is really and truly a balancing of priorities, which can, where possible, shift funds to areas of greater priority.
Thank you. I have one quite specific question here arising in the same area. Can you tell me, Ms. Dansereau or anyone, how much money did Conservation and Protection receive in response to the Williams report? There seems to be some conflict in that on the record.
I was not there, so I can't speak to this.
Mr. Bevan?
I was there, but I can't recall the exact number, and I would be loath to say one. One's popping around in my mind, but I can't verify whether it's accurate. So I don't have that off the top of my head.
Is that something that you would be able to determine for tomorrow?
I think so, yes.
Thank you very much. One of the issues that arises, I think, in the context of the operational and strategic review is the finding other people to do things that DFO does and offloading some of its responsibilities. One of the issues, one of the areas where this arises in catch monitoring, in the Williams report in 2005, the observation is that accurate catch monitoring is one of the core responsibilities for any credible fisheries management agency. Simply put, if harvest levels, including all mortalities, cannot be accurately estimated, fisheries cannot be carried out without significant risk to the stocks. At the time, Brian Williams heard testimony that in the BC Interior there was a wholly inadequate situation regarding catch monitoring, directly attributable to continually declining and uncertain levels of funding. That was 2004. Now in 2011, Mr. Jantz gave evidence here, he's the area chief of the BC Interior, that catch monitoring there relies significantly on bee-based pick fee funds that are not expected to be continued after next March. And that even at current levels, he does not have full coverage of the fishery in terms of geography or duration. So if catch monitoring is so important and is one of DFO's core responsibilities, why isn't it more stably funded? Ms. Dansereau?
I'll answer part of that, and obviously David and Sue can answer other parts. But I want to go back to one of the first words that you used, which was offloading of our core responsibilities, which we are not doing. We are defining, as governments always should, what are the core responsibilities of the federal government and of the department. Often what will happen in a department that's as old as ours is we can have mandate creep and we start doing things in decentralized organizations that we probably are doing too much of some things and we need to pull some of those back. And exercises such as strategic review and the deficit reduction action plan or strategic and operating review do exactly that. They force us, and rightly so, to go back and look at what we are doing and to ask the question, should we be doing this? Is that really our responsibility? And where things are not our responsibility, but they are important to Canadians, we hope to be able to find ways to continue to have that work done somehow. So whether or not all monitoring is equally important in all rivers or in all fisheries, I don't think we can categorically say yes, but clearly monitoring is going to be important regardless. So I'll let David speak more of the specifics of the question, but I need to make sure that we don't appear, we're not offloading our responsibilities.
Just to be clear, Ms. Dansereau, are you suggesting that contrary to what the words in the Williams report, that accurate catch monitoring is one of the core responsibilities of any credible fisheries management agency? Are you
I'm not
question?
questioning that, no, not at all. I'm questioning, it was the
So
very
then when
beginning
you're
of your
speaking-
statement was
Oh.
we are planning to offload some of our core responsibilities, and I was saying, no, we are not doing that. Now, whether or not everyone would agree that monitoring is core in every single area that we are, I don't know the answer. I would be seeking advice on that, but I'll let David answer to the specifics.
The evidence we have is that it is, to some extent in any event, being covered by B-based PIC fee funding, which is sunsetting in 2012. So just focusing on that fact, what is your
If I
response?
may, we've heard a few times this morning the idea that because something is sunsetting, it will disappear. And the approach of sunsetting and of B-based money, I realize that for some people in the bureaucracy, it's nervous making for them that programs are time limited. But in fact, what time-limited money does is ensure that at a certain point there is a serious evaluation of the usefulness, the utility of all the elements of that program, and if they're no longer useful, they should stop being done. So it's almost a mini strategic review of each program as it reaches its endpoint. Some are truly designed to be 5-year programs and come to an end. Others are designed to be reviewed and for us to go and seek additional funds to either discontinue some parts or continue some others. So we have no position at this table at this point that the money is either going to be there or not be there. As you've heard from Sue Farlinger, we are in a review of all of our sensitive programs, and we will be determining from those which are the elements that ought to go forward, maybe with increased requests for money, and which we could potentially do without.
Now, I think I'd agree, obviously, that catch monitoring is an essential component of the management of fisheries. Having said that, I don't believe that it's the responsibility of the organization, such as DFO, to do it. That is to say, to cause all of these things, or to actually collect the information directly from the landings. What it is our responsibility is to ensure that it is done. And in many fisheries, for example, we have hail in, hail out provisions. When you're going out to fish, what did you catch and what are you saying you caught? You have to declare what you're catching, then you have to land. It has to be dockside monitored. It has to go through sometimes observers process as well. All those data sets are then compared amongst themselves so that we can make sure there's no anomalies. An observed boat should not have a different catch than an unobserved boat. And the fishermen in those cases pay for the observers, they pay for the dockside monitors, they pay for the hail in, hail out calls, they often pay for the vessel monitoring systems, etc. That's their responsibility to give us the information we need to ensure that the stocks are sustainably managed. And clearly in some fisheries, we don't need to go that far because the risks posed by the fisheries relevant to the biomass is very much different. So we need to know the scale of the fishery. If you have a small recreational fishery on an abundant stock, you just want to make sure you have an idea of what ballpark you're in. You don't need to go down the point of imposing very significant costs on participants if the risks don't warrant it. That's the kind of call we're going to have to make in terms of interior fishing. If there's a high risk, we're going to have to find a way to get that information enhanced. If the risk is low because the period of the fishing is not a significant contributor to the overall mortality, then you don't have the same level of obligation to impose those criteria on the participants. So it's a matter of what's the right balance given the circumstances. But you do need to have enough information to know where you are relevant to the ability of the stock to withstand fishing mortality and what that fishing mortality is. But I'm not sure that we should be the ones who actually collect the information. We should be the ones who get it from the participants and from the various people who can provide alternatives, whether it's an observer or a buyer or whatever. And that information has to be made available to us in a usable fashion so that we aren't getting information a year afterwards in a sales slip, but rather getting information in real time. And we've seen tremendous changes in compliance in a number of fisheries as we've moved to that kind of model where it's the obligation of the fishermen and the participants to tell us how they're going to demonstrate they're in control and that they're compliant with the requirements. It's a reverse onus of proof in those cases. It's not our obligation to prove them that they are out of control. We do that in court, but on the ongoing basis, it's their obligation to prove to us and the market and the Canadian public that their harvest is sustainable.
Would you agree, though, that to the extent that the monitoring is being left to the monitored, you need to have a very robust system of oversight and audit of what they're doing, and that's not going to be cheap either.
Well, the monitoring in those cases is not left to the monitor. The monitoring is paid for by the participants. They pay the dockside monitors. They pay the observers. They pay the costs for the transponders. They pay the transmission costs for giving the data, etc. So they pay the bill, and we do the auditing. That's correct. And the auditing does have a number of ways of being made more effective. If you have different data sets from different independent sources, you've got an ability to do the comparison. Clearly, in the river system, when you're dealing with an artisanal FSC fishery or something of that nature, you're not dealing with something where you've got a group of people with the capacity to run elaborate systems, and we're going to have to take a look at how those harvests could pose a risk to the stock or not, and what kind of level of control we need on them. But it's not the fox guarding the chicken coop. It's the participants paying for an independent monitoring process.
I think I'd just like to add that part of the PICFI funding went in two directions. One is to the Integrated Salmon Dialogue process, which addressed the issue of catch monitoring from the stakeholders' perspective and First Nations perspective, as well as the catch monitoring strategy, the development of previous work, taking it out to various groups, including First Nations, recreational, commercial fishermen, and environmental groups, and looking at exactly how DFO would establish standards. And I think you have heard from Colin Masson on that, about the report and the work that he's done under the PICFI funding, and the catch monitoring strategy that now has been out for consultation for, I think, almost a year. And that catch monitoring strategy does for the Pacific region and all the fisheries in Pacific region just what David says. It looks at the fishing power. It looks at various elements related to effective fisheries management and how you have to set standards for different kinds of fisheries, different fishing power, different situations, mixed stock situations and other things, so that DFO is in a position to do its job to set those standards. And so I would say that we're quite advanced on that work. We did, in the interim with PICFI fund, catch monitoring in the Upper Fraser that Mr. Jantz referred to. And part of that catch monitoring strategy is both to inform us internally about the kind of risks that David talked about, but also to inform stakeholders who, quite frankly, to date, have spent more time pointing fingers at each other than they have in working with us to develop catch monitoring standards. We have exceptions to that, which I think have been noted along the way. But this is partially a social and education process, which is really letting all the stakeholders know that the same criteria are being applied to developing their management standards and to setting priorities. And therefore, to take the work that we do bilaterally with any group or First Nation and put it into this framework so that people understand why the catch monitoring standards are there. That's sort of a really important social step that has been a very big part of the development of catch monitoring in PICFI.
Coming back to one of the points we've been discussing earlier, that the reporting and the monitoring is to be done by the fishers, the monitoring is to be paid for by them, and the auditing is the responsibility of DFO, is kind of the structure that I understand from the evidence, from what I've heard this morning. One of the issues that was identified again by Mr. Nelson was that CNP has concerns as to the accuracy of catch reports, and he testified that fisheries officers have provided illegal catch information to resource managers, but that information has not been used. He also noted that fishery officers are not regularly involved in auditing catch reports. Do you believe that fishery officers should be involved in catch auditing, given their powers of search and inspection? Mr. Bennett?
I'd say that yes, they should be involved in catch auditing where that's a priority for that particular set of risks in that particular fishery. They need the right tools. If the tools aren't there in terms of getting the information data sets, then how do you audit if you're waiting for a year for sales slips and information in paper? That's not a very effective set of tools for fishery officers. So they need the right tools. That's something that has to be worked on with the catch monitoring system and fish managers. The other issue is what's the estimate based on, what kind of data did they have, and how much risk was posed by the additional catch, and was it something that would require priority on the other side of the house, the management side. So I think salmon's is not in the best situation in British Columbia, relevant to the especially Fraser River, given the number of participants, the kinds of fisheries, and the systems that have been in place in the past versus what we think is needed in the future. But there's work underway to change that, and it is a challenge, no question about it, when you're dealing with so many groups, with particularly when you're dealing with groups exercising an FSC right and they don't have a lot of infrastructure, et cetera, for these things. If you're dealing with commercial groups or recreational groups that have more resources, then there is the potential for having a much more quicker transformation to that new model. So I agree that there should be some work done on auditing, but there needs to be the right set of tools. Otherwise, the task becomes insurmountable for the CNP folks, and it doesn't become a priority for them if they don't have an outcome. Because that's another issue that we ask them to do, is don't spend resources where you're not going to have an outcome to control the risk.
So as I understand at the moment, the catch monitoring audit piece is not something that fisheries officers are doing. Will they have the resources to do that?
Again, that's not resources. What it is tools. And tools don't mean more money. Tools mean that there has to be a system of catch monitoring in place that provides fishery officers with the information that will then allow them to be much more focused. So it's not more fishery officers doing a bad system. It's the fishery officers getting the tools to do a better approach and getting better outcomes with the resources they've got.
But as I understand it, this is a job which they're not currently doing. If we're asking fisheries officers to add that to their responsibilities, do we not need more fisheries officers to do that?
No, what we need is follow up on the work that was described by Sue Farlinger about the changes in the catch monitoring, so that we provide the tools to the officers so they can get an outcome, they can get compliance, they can get what they need. Without having, we could solve this problem if we had a fishery officer at every landing point 24/7. We could definitely solve the problem. We turn them into catch monitors, and we take a highly trained, expensive to put in place public servant and turn them into somebody who's not exercising the whole suite of skills they've got. So that's not what we want to do. We want to have a different approach so that the officers can get the information they need to use for investigation.
Ms. Farlinger, do you agree then that having fisheries officers, the CNP and catch monitoring programs more closely aligned is a good thing to do?
Yes, I do.
What about Mr. Nelson's observation that there's not enough resources now among fisheries officers to do that?
I think the idea that using the resources we have in the most effective way is the answer to that question, and I think as Mr. Bevan mentioned, Randy may have been thinking very much in the traditional on-the-ground fishery officer way of doing business. And I think the reality is we're looking for the balance between having people on the ground doing this other kind of more sophisticated work and the kind of catch monitoring systems on the stock assessment and the fish management side that make all that work together for more effective monitoring. And I think much of the work that we've done in PICFI is aimed at doing exactly that, and also the reorganization in the department of having all the operational programs in a single grouping and better coordination of the work planning rather than a rather more traditional model of siloed work planning is the kind of things that will allow us to in fact find that right balance. And it will always change. It will always be one fishery or another that is more problematic because of fish abundance, because of some other problems. And we need to maintain that fluid balance so we can deliver the best possible monitoring.
As I listened this morning, I get the sense that you believe that there's a better way, but how that all works is still undefined, and the department is working on that. And I've provided you some snippets of evidence from people on the ground saying, no, we need more people on the ground, good old-fashioned stuff. And I guess that raises my mind, well, what if these new ideas don't come to fruition? What do you do in the meantime?
Just on a national perspective, I can definitely tell you these ideas are not necessarily that new, and they do work. They've been proven. So where we've introduced these procedures in different fisheries, the officers have had a much greater ability to get at compliance issues. They spend a little less time in the field, and they spend more time in front of computers, but the outcome is a much greater accountability on the part of resource users and the people out there on the water doing the fishing. So we've seen that this actually is a very well-proven way of getting results. The challenge is that it's fitting these kinds of ideas to fisheries where you have myriad participants and not a lot of resources on the part of some of those participants to take on these responsibilities to provide that information through third-party service providers. So that's the challenge. It's not so much are these concepts workable. They work. They've been proven in Canada and around the world. They do work. The issue is how do we improve the situation to deal with risks that may exist in the salmon fishery, and not to do it by, we've done this in the past. We've put lots of people on the river, and we've had problems in terms of cost of that relevant to presence elsewhere. And I'm not sure we got the results that would warrant. In other words, it's a very expensive option to have compliance through continued day and night presence. We need to find a better way to do it. We know there are better ways, and it's a matter now of identifying the risks. Which areas do we have the fishing power that can pose the risk to the stocks, and change those on a pilot and priority basis.
So just to try and answer your question, I think that to put it most simply, in fisheries management, if we are not confident about the monitoring or getting the kind of information that we need as a responsible manager, what we do is decrease access to the fishery in order to be more conservative. I think that's a useful general statement. I think that speaks to the evolution of the integrated groundfish fishery that the deputy referred to earlier, where the fishermen were cognizant of the benefits both for their own operations and for marketing in terms of being able to demonstrate the sustainability of their fishery, in that they were dealing with what in salmon we call the weak stock problem, and in groundfish we call the bycatch problem. Those fundamentally are things that drive how a fishery gets managed. So really what we're talking about here is taking things that are already in play. We have piloted demonstration share-based fisheries in salmon over the last 5 years with the resources. We've taken a look and are in the process of taking a look at what that means. Did we get better reporting? Did the fishermen get higher value? Were there processing advantages? Were there solutions to allocation problems? So the suite of fishery management questions that you asked, and then ultimately, were we better able to meet the conservation targets while still providing people with the access to the fish? So those are the kind of fundamental questions that we're asking ourselves about the salmon fishery and all other fisheries. And as David said, in some fisheries in Pacific, we have moved ahead. In some in the Atlantic coast, we have moved ahead. And we're continuing to try and work our way through those exact challenges in the salmon fishery, which is very, very complex.
I may come back to this, but for the moment, I wonder if we could move on now to issues of habitat monitoring and compliance. In the DFO's 1986 habitat policy, it states that as a guiding principle, there should be no net loss of productive capacity of habitats. We've heard from Jason Wang, area manager of OHEB and BC Interior, that from the operational level, all indications are that DFO is not achieving no net loss. Patrice LeBlanc, the Habitat Management Policy and Practices branch, says that DFO has no true measure to assess whether it is achieving no net loss. Would you agree that DFO is not meeting its objectives under the habitat policy and achieving no net loss?
I would say that the first part of the statement is the one that is critical, and that is that no net loss is a guiding principle as opposed to necessarily a metric that was ever intended to be measured on a centimeter by centimeter for habitat. I would say that we have areas that we can certainly improve on, but I don't think that the intention was ever that it would be that categoric. We are, as I think you know, looking at how to improve the system by taking the principle of no net loss potentially to an ecosystem base rather than a project by project base, to allow us to achieve the intended outcomes, which is to make sure that the fish have the habitat that they need in order to survive and to thrive.
So I'm not sure I understand the answer, Ms. Dansero. Are you saying it wasn't intended to be a policy that's measurable? I'm not quite sure I understand.
I don't think any of us at this table were actually here for the drafting of that policy in '86, but
it is still
it's
the
definitely
policy.
Still the policy. Definitely still the policy, and it has been over time translated into meaning that it is no net loss centimeter by centimeter of habitat. And I don't think, and no one has told me so far, that that was the original intention. That is a guiding principle. The original intention was to make sure that the fish have the habitat that they need in order to survive and to thrive. And that is still the intent that we try to apply. So I can't speak to what the intention was in 1986. I can't say how it has
but
been
let's look
used.
at it from today. How is it being interpreted? What is it that the department is doing? And I'm not quite sure. How is success? How is meeting this policy to be measured?
We do at this point take the approach that it is for every piece of habitat lost, another piece of habitat must be created, or we find some way to compensate. And we are doing it at the project by project, using the project by project approach.
You're seeking to do it at the project, but
No, we are in our authorizations. We seek to do it within our authorizations. Yes, we are not. I think we can all say as proficient at going back and monitoring to make sure that every project that we approved actually resulted in the protection that might have been required. So we are in this as in all things, in continuous mode of trying to find better ways to do that, and better ways to actually achieve protection for the fish, which is what the intent of this is.
what are you doing to address the fact that you're not properly auditing the application of the policy on a project authorization basis?
Well, it's a big country, and there are many levels of projects in the country, and so those projects that are of greater magnitude, both financially and with environmental impact, will receive greater attention both in the analysis of the project and its impacts and in taking a look at it over time. So some of the smaller projects, it's true, we will not have, again, we will not have the resources to go back and take a look at all of them, but again, it's a risk-based approach to determine which projects pose the greatest risk to hatched fish, and they get greater attention than those that pose a lower risk.
Okay, so would it be fair to characterize the state of the policy and its application today that it's applied on a project by project basis where authorizations are required, and the larger the project, the more likely it is that the results will be audited?
I would say that that's true, but Sue can speak more from an operational perspective, but I would say that that's true.
We do have resources in terms of monitoring habitat, but part of the program renewal that we're working on is to look at how, in fact, can you measure this in a way that can be reported back to fishermen, to environmentalists, to Canadians. And the whole idea of expanding out to an ecosystem approach, perhaps in this instance a watershed approach, really we hope will give us ways to develop monitoring on a broader scale that will help us report to ourselves and to the public about how effective the habitat program is. And that's really one of the focuses of the renewal in terms of taking a policy that was developed in 1986, which all of a sudden has become an expectation that we can measure, and now modernizing it and saying what are we going to do with this program that we can measure and we can report back on and demonstrate just how DFO programs are protecting habitat.
As I understand what you're telling us, it's only applied on an authorized project-by-project basis, and you are trying to figure out how to apply it to an ecosystem management broader, not simply a project basis. So it's, you would agree that it's not being applied in that broader way?
I don't think I would go that far, and I don't have the evidence to support that kind of a statement. I do think what we have been doing since 1986 is with great thought and concern by a lot of people in the department long before I was ever there, giving due consideration to what the fish required in their habitat across the board, and not and so whether or not the specifics of no net loss were met on a case-by-case basis, I don't think we can say, and I don't think we would say. But the principle that the policy was trying to address, which is to ensure that the fish have sound habitat in which to survive and thrive, that principle is very much alive and well in the department through monitoring, but also through a project-by-project approach. Yes, we would like to expand it out and make it broader, but together, if all of the people are of like mind that are working in this program, they do end up with an ecosystem approach, ecosystem-based approach.
The 2009 report of the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development recommended that DFO determine what actions are required to fully implement the 1986 habitat policy and confirm whether it intends to implement all aspects of the policy. And DFO's response in 2009 was that by March of 2010, it was committed that by March 2010 it would determine what actions are required to fully implement that policy. So that commitment was made in 2009. And the evidence we've had, and I think it's consistent with what you're telling us this morning, is that you're still working on renewing and improving and applying this policy. Why has this taken so long?
It's a complicated policy, and it's, as I said before, it's a big country. We have many types of ecosystems, many types of projects, many types of expectations from the policy and from the department. So it was, I think, overly optimistic for us to think that we could have finished by 2010. It will take us another little bit of time yet, and I actually think that these kinds of statements should have a broader endpoint because they should always be under review. We should always be looking at how we do things and whether or not we can improve on what we do. And so there will never be a point, in my view, where we've actually reached nirvana and know exactly what the perfect answer is.
However, there was a commitment made.
Yes.
And so can you be more specific about when you intend to meet that commitment?
We're working very hard on this with staff across the department, and we have not yet even begun consultation, so we would have to have some consultation on this. But our hope is to have, and I say a hope, I can't say firm, definitive, because there are other factors that affect our timelines. But I certainly hope that by this time next year we have a new habitat policy.
You have a new habitat policy,
Mm-hmm.
so that's not the,
Well,
that wasn't the commitment, I think. The commitment was to report on where you were on implementing the existing one. By March 2000, determine what action would be to fully implement the habitat policy.
Well, no, but through this work, we're confirming whether it intends to implement all of this, and all of that leads to research
Okay.
into what parts of this we ought to be continuing, as I said earlier, and what parts of this we should be doing a little bit differently, and that's part of that.
So by September of 2012.
As I said, I hope. I can't commit.
We've heard that one of the aspects that you've alluded to is the monitoring of habitat on a project authorization basis, and perhaps are there some attempts here to streamline, build efficiencies into the habitat monitoring program this way?
Yes, there are, but there's also an attempt to, mostly there's an attempt to prioritize. So there are some areas that the fisheries are not as either iconic culturally or economically or otherwise as in other parts of the country, and the risks to their fisheries by certain activities are not as high as they would be around Fraser sockeye, for example. So by Fraser sockeye will always have a very high place on the priority list, and who knows at the end of this process whether or not more attention would not be placed on the habitat requirements for the Fraser sockeye than other fisheries that the habitat is much more stable and the impacts are not quite as meaningful. So it's a question of prioritizing to make sure that we are putting our resources in the right places and having a risk-based approach, so that we're not using the same level of resources for activities that have a much different risk profile.
One of remind me of the environmental process modernization plan, I think is the code word for looking at, it's a wrong expression, is the program by which the major projects are identified and voluntary reporting is in place for smaller projects, is that?
A little bit. There are 2 or 3 program areas. One is the major projects management approach, which is for very high risk projects, and a lot of attention is placed on them. I think I don't normally use acronyms, but unfortunately I know this one by the acronym, the EFMP, is a program, pardon?
EPMP.
EPMP, there you go. Is a risk-based approach, is work that was done in the mid-2000s, I think, to start the process of taking a risk-based approach and working with proponents on projects so that they had the information that they needed in order to make decisions that would result in not creating a harmful alteration or to the habitat. So that's the beginning of a risk-based approach, and we need to continue in that line of work to make sure that we're putting our resources in those areas where there's the greatest likelihood of us making a positive difference.
But is it not correct that one of the impacts of this, smaller projects are now carried on below DFO's radar?
To some extent, yes, but we, as I say, we have materials that people are supposed to be using and are using to make decisions on the kinds of projects, on the project that they will implement, and we do some monitoring. And Sue, I think, can speak much more to sort of the implementation of that. We think it's working.
But before you answer that, Ms. Froninger, just to put it into perspective, we've had some, again, evidence, in this case from Mr. Wang, with respect to some of the implications that he sees from the voluntary reporting, that there has been a reemergence of unsustainable practices on foreshore development, and where previously there's been some control, and I guess there are issues of overall impacts from a number of small projects, and that essentially, I think he's saying it's not working well at that level. Can you comment on that?
I can. I think the intention is fairly clear, which is to set out the information for people who are working on and around water to tell them how to do a project in a way that wouldn't have an impact on fish habitat. And with experts like Mr. Wang and his staff, that they focus their efforts on those projects which are more complex and which in fact will have an impact, and therefore, you know, require more analysis and work with the proponent in terms of how to not only avoid those impacts, but if they have them, how to mitigate them and compensate for them. And so I do think that there has been a shift, and there also has been a more recent shift in terms of monitoring resources to go back and take a look at those that public education and information and whether it's being effective. And I think that is part of the reason, not only the report of the Commissioner and the Environment, but also taking a look at the program to make sure we've got that right balance again between monitoring. If we have a system where we're setting standards and monitoring becomes more important, we need to make sure that the program balance is there. So I am quite certain that there are areas where there is more activity, and our question is, how do we adjust our resources of our habitat biologists and technicians' time, and in fact fishery officers where they're required, to make sure that those standards are being met. And I can't comment specifically on Jason's experience on the ground, but I do think it is an ongoing challenge. There's more and more activity all the time, and really our challenge is to adjust this system so that we are doing the required monitoring so that people meet the standards, rather than having each and every project monitored or audited specifically by a habitat biologist. So once again, it's a balancing to get the best effect. But there are more activities going on each and every year in habitat.
Mr. Bailey, does this major project approach account for the cumulative risks that come from a lot of small activities, and is there any way that the department is addressing those issues?
I think it's fair to say there's about $300 billion in planned economic activity in Canada. It's huge. There's vast numbers of small projects underway, etc. We've seen that through the use of standards and through the use of class authorizations, we've been able to reduce our play on proposals from about 12,000 a year down to 7,000, but the workload is just exploding, and the old method of dealing with proponents and just talking to them about their plans and not going out and looking for compliance, not monitoring the effects, etc. That's not sustainable, and that's why we're looking at reevaluating things. But one of the things we want to do is set more standards and have that available for Canadians to use. And for example, when you're building, you have a building permit, you get that from contractors, etc. You don't necessarily you get that process to get your process underway, and we want to have something similar. We don't think it's the best use of time to have us looking at plans and then not looking at the environment. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So what we want to do is evaluate whether we can use more of these class authorizations linked to standards and linked to clear description to Canadians of what they need to do to comply with the Fisheries Act, and then having more monitoring to ensure that that's in fact taking place. It's a huge challenge. I mean, I think that the easiest way to stop any kind of degradation is to stop all human activities. That's not a very practical alternative, and I think we're going to have to look at what we are facing in terms of development and society's need for a balance there to keep the ecosystem in a sustainable state, as well as allowing people the freedom to move ahead with projects. We need to do that by giving them better understanding of the rules and to have better follow through on projects.
A couple of points. First of all, I don't think anyone would diminish the significance and difficulty in the task. And as I understand the process, you have obligations to get authority for large projects. There's a voluntary compliance with smaller projects. And as you point out, there's not much monitoring. And I haven't heard anything about someone looking at the cumulative impact. So my first question is there someone assigned to look at this issue from the perspective of the cumulative impacts of all of this myriad of human activity? I'm looking for anyone who can answer.
No, because I think that part of what was described is in terms of how we're looking at the policy is the current policy is based on project by project, no net loss, net gain kind of thing, and your question is not answered by the current policy. What we need to do is look at how we're handling ourselves in regards to management of the impacts on habitat, and to find a way of going forward. Because if you look at what we're doing right now, the answer is we don't have the cumulative impact is not being looked at. We're going to have to look at a different way of approaching things if we're going to have better understanding of that. We are obviously looking at trying to preserve fish habitat and avoid negative impacts from major projects, and providing people with the tools to not have a negative impact in putting in their wharves or their foreshore of their properties. But that's going to have to be further developed on our part, and we need to look at how to shift some of our resources from that into monitoring.
Okay. And Ms. Ryan, perhaps you can answer the question. The other point, which I think I hear people saying is not up to scratch, is in monitoring the impacts of our authority has been granted and conditions have been put on it. Can you comment on the quality of the monitoring and your capacity in the region to do it?
Well, since early 2004, we have had more resources added to the region to do monitoring. We have worked with CMP to delineate the roles and responsibilities between the habitat monitors and CMP, so there have definitely been improvements in that area. But the larger question really is no net loss a metric that can be measured, and if it isn't, what is? And how would we then measure our success and be able to report back on it? So I think that's very much a part of the thinking in terms of the whole program renewal and the review of the policy. So I think I would say, yes, we do monitor, but is it enough? No, and that's why we need to take a look at it. And really even to be able to understand what at what scale we should be measuring that to report success of it.
Mr. Bevan, I wonder if I might ask you a related question, which is your relationship as the department with Environment Canada. What is your understanding as to whose responsibility is currently your department's or Environment Canada's to research and monitor for contaminants and their effects on Fraser River sockeye?
I think I'll turn this over to the deputy for a more complete answer, but clearly the Section 36 has been the responsibility of environment. Section 35, the responsibility of DFO. That's the simple answer, and I know there's much more completeness to an answer. I turn it to the deputy.
Ms. Dansero?
Thank you. Yeah, it is a complicated situation, and it is a decision that was made, as we call in our language, the machinery world. There was a machinery change made in, I think it was the mid-1990s, to transfer responsibility from DFO to Environment Canada. However, it wasn't, I think there were some areas that were left unclear in that transfer, and so the Deputy Minister of Environment Canada and I are working our way through that right now, obviously with recommendations that we will be making to our respective ministers to see the best way to with the resources that we have to achieve the objectives that we need to achieve, that Section 36 is trying to achieve.
So then I take it you accept that that it's not clearly out of your hands to look into the monitoring and research, and I'm being quite specific here, monitoring and researching contaminant effects on fish.
I wouldn't say that it's not out of our hands. It is out of our hands, but there were pockets in the country when the transfer was made where we retained some of the responsibilities, and that is what we're looking at right now. But the transfer has been made. Funds were even transferred over, but there were areas where, by mutual agreement, I think, back in the time when this was done, where there was mutual agreement for us to continue doing some pieces of the work. And that's what we're looking at now to see really where the responsibility for this should lie.
We have an exhibit 980, Strategic Review of Toxic Chemicals Research, which was prepared in 2003 by DFO. And at page 2 it says DFO's mandate states that it is responsible for policies and programs in support of Canada's economic, ecologic, and scientific interests in oceans and inland waters, and for the conservation and sustainable utilization of Canada's fisheries, resource, and marine and inland waters. And I emphasize this: conservation and protection can only be achieved by understanding how all anthropogenic and natural stresses, including the introduction of toxic chemicals, affect the ability of aquatic ecosystems to withstand those stresses and the capacity of fish habitats to sustain the production of fish. The overall objective of the department's toxic chemicals research has been to determine the effects of toxic chemicals on fish habitats, aquatic ecosystems, and human use of aquatic ecosystems. Are you saying that that's not part of DFO's mandate?
I think Laura would be better placed to address a purely scientific question such as this, but I'm not reading these paragraphs to mean that we should be doing the actual monitoring of the toxic substances, which I think is where the management or the enforcement, which is where, that's a different question than whether or not we should be studying whether or not the toxic substances will have an impact on the fish. So I read this more as science and research rather than enforcement and monitoring.
It seems to be a direct link between the two, isn't there, between research and monitoring on this particular event?
I'm not sure. It's a little bit, as David described before, on the catch monitoring. It's not necessary that we actually do the monitoring. It's important that we have the data. And in the federal system, we do share data. So if there's data available through a monitoring system, it doesn't matter if it's DFO that does it or if it's Environment Canada.
The research is DFO's responsibility, but that doesn't necessarily mean that monitoring for contaminants in anadromous fish is DFO's responsibility.
I would say that's true, and again, it's a matter of the departments making sure that we get the maximum work with the best utilization of resources. So Environment Canada may be better situated to do some of this because they do it for other reasons as well. They do some of this for human health and some of it for other factors. And so if they are if they're getting some data, then we would use the data for what we need. Now, whether or not I would agree that we that this is a priority for this year, I think in a general sense, yes. But if you, I don't know how it fits with our overall science program. But I do know that if we wanted to understand fish in their ecosystem, it's important for us to understand this as well. Whether or not it's even that is a core function of our department, as opposed to getting the research from somewhere else, having some other scientist having done that, it would be something that we would be looking at. So the knowledge clearly is important to us. How that knowledge is generated is something that we would look at.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, I see it's come to be 12:30.
Thank you very much. Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.